Conventional wisdom says that foreign policy doesn't matter in U.S. presidential elections. Quote, "It's the economy, stupid," was long thought to be political gospel, but this election might be different. According to polls, a divided America cares deeply about the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, about the influx of migrants from south of the border, and about the escalating climate crisis. With the election just 2 months away, Talking Foreign Policy takes a look at where the presidential candidates and the electorate stand on the major foreign policy challenges facing the United States. I'm your host, Michael Scharf. In this broadcast, I've assembled a group of top foreign policy experts from across the political spectrum to answer the question, how will foreign policy issues affect the 2024 presidential election? Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy, the quarterly radio show and podcast. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, the former dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Today, we're going to be talking about the role that foreign policy issues will play in the 2024 presidential election. In the next hour, we'll look at how the presidential candidates differ on their approach to the Russian-Ukraine conflict, negotiating peace in the Middle East, the U.S. relationship with China, controlling migration across our southern border, and responding to the global climate crisis. I've assembled an all-star panel of experts for today's conversation. From New Haven, Connecticut, we're joined by Harold Hongju Ko, the Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. The former dean of Yale Law School, Professor Ko also served as the legal advisor of the U.S. Department of State during the Obama administration and as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor during the Clinton administration. Recently, Professor Ko represented Ukraine against Russia in cases before the International Court of Justice and the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy, Harold.
My pleasure, Michael.
Now, from the nation's capital, I'm happy to welcome John Bellinger, co-chair of Arnold and Porter's Global Law and Public Policy Group, who previously served as the legal advisor of the U.S. Department of State and the legal advisor of the National Security Council during the George W. Bush administration. Thanks for joining us, John.
Nice to be back.
And from Nashville, Tennessee, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Michael Newton, professor of law and political science at Vanderbilt University. A former JAG colonel, Dr. Newton served as the senior advisor to the ambassador at large for war crimes issues in the U.S. Department of State during the Clinton and Bush administrations. Dr. Newton is one of the few individuals who has litigated cases both before the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Thanks for being on Talking Foreign Policy, Mike.
Well, thank you, and it's such a joy to hear the voices of friends and colleagues.
And from Arlington, Virginia, we're joined once again by Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Nobel Peace Prize nominated Public International Law and Policy Group. It is always great to have you on our show, Paul.
Oh, Michael, it's a pleasure to be here again.
And finally, sitting just across from me in the IdeaStream Public Media Studio in Cleveland, Ohio, is Milena Stereo, an international law expert who holds the Distinguished University Professorship at Cleveland State University. It is great to have you back on Talking Foreign Policy, Milena.
It's great to be back, Michael.
Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, elections don't usually turn on foreign policy. I'd like to start with a question for all our panelists. Why do you think the electorate should care more about foreign policy issues now than in past elections? Let's start with Harold.
I think for two reasons, because the Ukraine war with Russia and the Middle East conflict that's brewing with Israel and Hamas are traditional threats, but at a scale and level that have enormous consequences for the future. But secondly, because there are a whole range of foreign policy issues that are brand new: climate change, global pandemics, AI, cyber conflict, on which the new administration is going to have to deal. And so those are issues on which foreign policy will make a huge difference for the future of our citizens.
And John Ballinger, what would you add to that?
Well, as Harold says, we have simultaneous conflicts going on in the Ukraine and the Middle East that have really important implications for the United States. And we have two candidates and parties that have starkly contrasting visions of the U.S. role in the world. President Trump and his vice presidential candidate are preaching more of isolationism and U.S. retreat from the world, sort of back to what happened between World War I and World War II, and Democratic nominee Harris and the Biden administration that she's continued have been focused much more on engagement in the world, U.S. leadership, and working with allies. So that's a big choice for Americans.
It is. Now, Mike Newton, what would you add?
Well, these experts would talk about an interconnected and interdependent world. We've had the luxury in some decades past of Americans feeling as though they were disconnected and could chart their own pathway and rugged individualism and rugged independence. That's all past. I think Americans feel foreign policy impacts in their daily lives in ways that are very subtle, but often in their face. And in this election, like as John correctly said, the foreign policy differences are stark and will absolutely affect Americans' lives. And that's what elections are won and lost about.
Paul, what's your take on this?
I would just amplify what Harold, John, and Mike have said and take it one step further, which I think is where Mike is headed. Not only will this election have measurable consequences and distinct consequences for foreign policy, and it will impact Americans' lives, they actually know it. The Americans like to pretend that foreign policy doesn't matter, but we're no longer pretending it doesn't matter. We know that our foreign policy choice will have very specific consequences for us as Americans.
And Melina Stereo,
we're aware of that.
You get the last word.
Sure, I would agree with everything that everybody has said, and I would just add that we live in an interconnected, globalized world where what America does affects other countries, what other countries do affects America, and it would be foolish and short-sighted to pretend that foreign policy issues do not matter.
All right, and a lot of different topics have been raised already. Perhaps the last time foreign policy played such an important role in a presidential election was back in 1968. The issue was the Vietnam War. This is the lightning round. Let me ask each of you, what one foreign policy issue do you think is most important in this election? Let's go through it again, starting with Harold.
I think the single issue is not so much a particular area of foreign policy as it is a strategic approach. Will the United States deal with the world multilaterally and principally through diplomatic solutions and alliances, or will it go about doing things unilaterally, using force, sanctions, and various kinds of tariffs and other kinds of unilateral weapons? I think only the former gives us the range of options that allow us to deal with complex problems in a globalized world.
Now, John Bellinger, you were legal advisor of the National Security Council and then the Department of State right after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Do you think the so-called global war on terrorism is still one of or the most important foreign policy issues of our time?
So I was actually in the White House Situation Room on the day of the 9/11 attack, so I know firsthand what it's like to be in the middle of a catastrophic terrorist attack. I think more than any other issue, we have to protect the United States and Americans. We have to be vigilant, especially in guarding against attacks from Iran and others. But that said, I don't think that the global war on terror is our most important foreign policy. I would actually point to the Russia-Ukraine war, because that is whether we will stand up and support Ukraine and stand up to Russian aggression, because that is something that both our allies and our enemies are watching to see how the U.S. will handle.
Mike Newton, what do you think is the most important foreign policy issue?
Well, I mean, not to hit a consistent theme, but wars and rumors of wars, and to put a finer point on it, what really is America's role in leading the world and following the world, in trying to stay isolated, because these are all deeply interconnected problems, whether it's sanctions, whether it's migrant flows, whether it's contributions to environmental degradation. There's a whole range of interconnected problems. But Americans want to know what wars affect us, and in particular, what are our interests? And I think we need to be much more nimble in articulating exactly what our interests are. John just said, European security, vital American interest. But I'm waiting for administrations, whoever wins the election, to articulate those for interest to the American public and get buy-in in ways we've done in previous conflicts.
Paul, who do you think what issue do you think the electorate will have on its mind when it pulls the ballot box?
Michael, I'm gonna go off the board, and I don't think it's going to be on their mind, but I think Sudan, hugely important. So many of our allies and so many of our strategic competitors literally have skin in the game in Sudan, and unless we can stop that civil conflict, stop the famine, stop the potential genocide, and move that back into a democratic transition, we're going to have huge problems in East Africa, and that will divert our resources from the other issues that we've been identifying on this program.
Okay, and finally, Milena.
I'm going to go with the Middle East, the war in Gaza, which I think will be a hugely important issue for this election. The war, as we've seen, has the potential to spill over into Lebanon with the involvement of Hezbollah, and has the potential to destabilize the entire region. I think that will be a hugely important issue for the upcoming election.
Okay, so my next question is for Dr. Michael Newton. Mike, you served as a high-level advisor under first a Democratic president and then a Republican president. In his book, Power and Constraint, Professor Jack Goldsmith of Harvard Law School wrote that foreign policy differences between presidents are rare because of legal and political constraints and the entrenched bureaucracy. Was that your experience at the State Department during the transition between the Clinton and Bush administrations?
Well, we actually had a pretty smooth transition in the sense that people were qualified, they meant well. There was a centrist view of American foreign policy, and then we innovated on the margins. But I have to say, that was then, this is now. The foreign policy differences are stark between the people that would staff the agencies, and the guardrails of law that are built into our system remain valid. But there's a new generation of people who want to try to avoid those checks and balances. So you could see wild swings, which is why I go back to the basic blocking and tackling of foreign policy: deterrence, interests, alliances. We've got to get back to the basics, and if we do that, those things remain static. And oftentimes, what we're seeing in both the media and in the public discourse are distant reflections of those core debates. I think if we stick to the core debates, we'll be just fine.
All right, so related to those guardrails, Harold Koh just published a new edition of his critically acclaimed book, The National Security Constitution in the 21st Century, with Yale University Press. And I couldn't help but notice when I looked this up that it was referred to as a masterpiece in a recent review. Now, Harold, your book suggests that the checks and balances that Michael was talking about and the legal constraints on presidential power in foreign affairs have been eroding. Can you tell us about your concerns?
Thank you for mentioning the book, Michael. The book tracks the evolution of the Constitution's checks and balances in foreign affairs since the beginning of the Republic to the present. And frankly, it disagrees with Jack Goldsmith, who was actually my research assistant on the first version of this book. I would say that since the end of the 20th century, the idea of the basic continuity of foreign policy has radically changed. And so now presidents are increasingly doing a zero-sum operation of foreign policy, changing as many things as they can from presidency to presidency. And the big challenge is, are we going to have a system of shared powers, which is what the constitutional design requires, or are we going to have a system of executive unilateralism? And we have a system where Republicans tend to seize power proactively And Democrats tend to seize power reactively, but in both cases, the trend is unilateralist. I think this creates a very serious concern. Lawyers in the government try to free the president so that he can deal with national security threats. But the accumulation of all of these changes over time have come to the real possibility that the president may himself be the national security threat. And we saw that with Trump in his first term in office, and we may well see it again if he returns to office.
Well, we are certainly in a different time than what Michael experienced between the transitions back between Clinton and Bush. And Harold, I think your book explains some of the differences and why this has become such a significant issue. It's time now for a short break. When we return, we're going to talk about the candidates' differing approaches regarding the two most important conflicts of our day, Ukraine and Gaza. So stay with us. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Michael Scharf, former dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law and the president of the American branch of the International Law Association. We're joined today from New Haven by former State Department legal advisor Harold Hongju Ko, from D.C. by former State Department legal advisor John Bellinger, from Nashville by retired JAG Colonel Mike Newton, from Arlington by the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group Paul Williams, and with me here in the studio is Professor Milena Stereo of Cleveland State University College of Law. We've been talking about foreign policy and the 2024 presidential election. In this segment, we're going to look at how the candidates differ on resolving the two greatest conflicts of our time, the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. So Democratic nominee Vice President Harris has said the U.S. will support Ukraine's fight against Russia for as long as it takes. Donald Trump, on the other hand, has said he would end the Russia-Ukraine war within 24 hours of assuming office, and his running mate, J.D. Vance, has said the U.S. should cut off aid to Ukraine immediately. For full disclosure, Paul Williams is serving as an advisor for peace negotiations to the Ukrainian president. Paul, let me start with you. What is the best justification for the Biden-Harris policy on Ukraine?
Well, Michael, let me answer that question by saying the best Biden-Harris policy, or in future the best Harris policy, would be to tweak their existing policy. It's been good on most accounts, but let's be honest, it's been timid and it's been tardy. I think there's the making of a serious policy, which is to be all in on our economic and military support for the Ukrainians, and to be clear that we have red lines, and ending basically the aggressive war against Ukraine is that red line. I think Harris is close enough to that and could easily move into that being her policy, and I think you'd find our NATO allies supporting that. And that's what's likely to bring an end to the war, demonstrating our resolve, demonstrating NATO cohesion, and demonstrating to Putin that there's a new sheriff in town. Same old sheriff, but slightly new sheriff in town.
Well, it's not going to happen tomorrow. So let me ask, as with Vietnam and Iraq, after a period of time, the American people wanted the U.S. to pull out of Afghanistan. Colonel Mike Newton, are we approaching that point with Ukraine?
Oh, I don't think by a long shot, in part because you know that I would totally agree with Paul Williams on this. There's this odd stasis that very few people have commented on. We're doing just enough to keep the Ukrainians in the fight. The Chinese are doing just enough to keep the Russians in the fight, just enough on the margins. And I don't think there's been enough attention paid to all the interconnected dimensions of this, whether it's trade or the future of China or the future of NATO. No, we're not approaching the point of pulling out. What we are approaching is the point of no return, in that the current policy is not working. And we've got to be nimble to reframe that in a way that supports human rights, that supports NATO, that supports prosecution of war crimes, and crimes against humanity that really does stake out a new American role in the world vis-a-vis China and Russia, and Iran, of course, a lesser player.
All right. Well, our panelists today are clearly interventionists when it comes to Ukraine, but J.D. Vance believes that we're basically looking at Afghanistan. He is rolling the dice that the American people want us out. So let me ask Melina Stereo, what is different between the Ukraine and Afghanistan? What more is at stake in Ukraine?
Sure, Michael. In Afghanistan, basically the U.S. rationale justification for sending forces to Afghanistan was to combat the terrorist forces of al-Qaeda and Taliban that had been responsible for the 9/11 attacks against the United States. A couple of years ago, when the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, most would agree that those forces had been defeated. In Ukraine, we're dealing with a vastly different situation where we have Russia, a nuclear power that has launched an illegal full-scale invasion that has committed acts of aggression against the sovereign state of Ukraine. And that type of aggression committed by a nuclear power has huge potential to destabilize the region, to threaten the sovereignty, the territorial integrity of other European nations, as well as our NATO allies. So the two cases are just starkly different, and I would absolutely agree with Colonel Newton that the case for staying in Ukraine and continuing to support Ukraine is very, very strong.
So if Trump and Vance win, I'm wondering if we really would pull out of Ukraine or cut off the aid right away, like J.D. Vance said. Let me turn the next question to our former State Department legal advisors, John Bellinger and Harold Koh. Do you two think that the options and consequences are really as stark as the candidates have been discussing? What role would our European allies and the U.S. Congress play in shaping U.S. foreign policy toward Ukraine, regardless of the desires of the next president? Harold, do you want to start?
Yes, I mean, I think J.D. Vance has to answer the question, if Ukraine falls to Putin, what is he going to do about Moldova and Lithuania and the Baltics? The Republican Party has come a long way from Ronald Reagan and his approach to the Soviet Union. When the most recent diplomatic deal was done with the Russians to get the hostages out, Trump called Putin. He didn't call Biden to congratulate him. And I think there's a real challenge here, which is there a containment strategy for Putin that would apply if you're going to let him succeed in Ukraine?
And John Bellinger, what's your take?
So let me echo something I said at the top of the hour, which is, Ukraine is not just some faraway place of no interest to the United States. Our allies all around the world, in Europe and Taiwan, in the Middle East, are watching. Is the U.S. going to support Ukraine, or is it going to cut and run? Same with our adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, all watching closely. So I think a majority in Congress support U.S. assistance for Ukraine. So if Trump were elected and tried to immediately cut a peace deal, particularly a bad peace deal for Ukraine with Putin, I think that Congress would very much oppose that. And I want to just echo something Harold said here, because I just think it is so unprecedented to have former President Trump continuing to praise President Putin and, in fact, other authoritarian leaders, and to criticize our allies. It's just odd that President Trump continues to praise Putin after his aggression in Ukraine and his worst violation, really, of international law and international norms since World War II.
Thank you for adding that. Now let's turn our attention to the war in Gaza. The U.S. population was shocked by the barbarity of the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel in October, but sentiment in some quarters began to shift as the Israeli response resulted in tens of thousands of Palestinian civilian deaths. We've all seen the images of U.S. university campuses across the country roiled by protests against the war in Gaza. Now, some believe that President Biden painted himself into a corner of unconditional support for Netanyahu's policies, while Vice President Harris has been described as the loudest voice within the Biden administration, talking about the need for Israeli restraint and promoting a ceasefire. Let me start by asking Melina Stereo, what impact did the Gaza conflict have on the Democratic primaries?
Well, I think it had a significant impact. While President Biden was still a candidate, because of this appearance of his, as you said, unconditional support for President Netanyahu's policies, President Biden was losing support and losing potential votes, and in particular in battleground states which have significant Arab populations, such as, for example, Michigan. Now that we have Kamala Harris, the current vice president, as the Democratic nominee, I think the tide is turning a little bit, and I think that she's at least perceived as perhaps slightly more flexible when it comes to support for Israel. So I do think that this will have a significant impact, though, on the upcoming election.
So let me turn to Paul Williams, who has been involved in 24 peace negotiations across the globe over the past 30 years. Paul, is there really a realistic pathway to a ceasefire and eventually a wider peace between Israel and Hamas?
Michael, if you had asked me this question about any other conflict around the globe today, I would explain yes, there's always a realistic pathway to a ceasefire and eventually a wider peace. But Mike, in the situation of Gaza, Hamas, terrorist organization, we've seen what they did on October 7th. We see how they're fighting the war. So, that knocks down the possibility of a ceasefire in a very significant way. And then, quite frankly, the leadership of both of the parties involved in this conflict have been indicted, or there's a request for indictment by the prosecutor before the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And when you set the stage with these actors, it's really difficult to see a pathway to a ceasefire.
I think you've made the case for cynicism, but VP Harris is committed to trying. So let me ask Harold, as former State Department legal advisor, you've also been involved in peace negotiations representing the United States. What role could the U.S. constructively play in pursuing peace between Israel and Hamas?
I think under the Biden administration, it's already played that role. It's done two things. It's to set up a ceasefire framework in 3 stages that's been endorsed by a Security Council resolution, and then against the background that if that ceasefire can be agreed to by both sides and take hold, they can move to a broader framework that would be supplanting the Oslo Accords as a path going forward that would be supported by a group of use the term moderate Middle Eastern states like Egypt and Saudi Arabia. This has not gotten much attention in the United States because of all the turmoil about our election, but I think it's another example of diplomacy and multilateral diplomacy being one of the strengths of this administration, which could be jettisoned if we shifted to a transactional unilateralist kind of leader like Trump for the next round.
And Harold, you sound a bit more optimistic than Paul Williams on this.
Well, I think that Hamas, I think I share his view of Hamas. The real question is Hamas is badly damaged, and the question is, will they actually be the people making the arrangement? What they need to be able to do is, at this point, 2 things: release hostages and agree to stop killing people themselves. But there are bigger forces now in the Middle East that are, I think, eager to bring the state of affairs since October to an end, or at least to some kind of limbo, so that it doesn't become a region-wide conflagration of the kind that Melania was describing.
Now, John Bellinger, you were the former National Security Council legal advisor, as well as the former State Department legal advisor. From that experience, what political risks does an administration face by trying to play the role that Harold has outlined?
Well, so let me first just put a couple of names to the work that's being done. I think Secretary of State Tony Blinken and CI Director Bill Burns, with whom I worked very closely, Director Burns when he was at the State Department, are really 2 extraordinary public servants, and American people owe them a great debt. They have been working endlessly, both of them, to try to work out a peace agreement. But as you say, this comes at sort of the worst possible time politically for the United States to be trying to work out a peace agreement. And it's unfortunate that support for Israel and the conflict in Gaza have become partisan political issues in the United States. There's been always traditional bipartisan support for Israel, and that continues. But it's unfortunate, I think, that Republicans, and of course I served in a Republican administration, are now trying to paint the Biden administration as insufficiently supportive of Israel. I think the Biden administration has been extremely supportive of Israel, but they've also been trying to make efforts to avoid civilian casualties. And of course, they don't want the U.S. to be drawn into a conflict. So, all of these efforts by U.S. negotiators comes at an extremely partisan time in the United States.
And a lot of this are political slogans and campaign propaganda. But let me ask, Donald Trump has blamed the Biden administration for hindering Israel from, quote, finishing the job. Colonel Mike Newton, what would finishing the job look like if Trump were president?
Well, I mean, I may not answer your question directly, but I'll try my best. You can label me the irrational idealist here in the group. I think finishing the job means a long-term sustainable peace. That's in Israel's interest. That's in the larger interests of the region. That's in a lot of moderate Sunni Arab states. I think you have to recognize two things. Finishing the job for me means, number one, as Harold said, supplanting the Oslo Accords. That framework is essentially dead after all these years and is not a viable pathway forward. To the extent that people keep invoking Oslo, it simply traps us in the past. It's time to replace that with a better framework that creates a sustainable peace. And then the second big thing, which nobody's yet mentioned, is the real strategy for containing Iranian influence in the region. The Iranians are gradually encircling Saudi Arabia, key U.S. ally. I think it's time to go big and go home. Now, in military terms, finishing the job for the Israelis would have meant cutting off the Rafah border crossings on day one. They didn't do that in military terms. In diplomatic terms, it would have meant a different strategy of reacting, but in a more thoughtful, rational way that carried alliances with them. So right now, they're in the worst of both worlds. The military balance is beginning to change on the ground, but unless we use that as the fulcrum for a larger, long-term, sustainable peace deal, then all is in vain. And I agree with Harold. Hostages have to be released, all hostages, to include remains of deceased hostages, so that people and families can be reunited. Yeah. That's
all right,
vital.
Michael, I have to break in here because it is now time for another short break. I think that the experts have made it very clear what's at stake in both Ukraine and Gaza and how different the candidates' approaches are to those. When we return, we're going to be discussing 4 other issues that could affect the outcome of the 2024 presidential election: U.S. support of NATO, tariffs on Chinese imports, cracking down on immigration from south of the border, and responding to climate change. We'll be back in a minute. This is Michael Scharf, former dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by 5 distinguished foreign policy experts, and we've been talking about how foreign policy issues will influence the 2024 presidential election. In this final segment of our show, we're going to be focusing on NATO, trade with China, immigration from Mexico, and responding to the global climate crisis. Let's begin with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. That's the Western military's alliance of 32 states that's been around since 1949. Now, we've heard Donald Trump say that the U.S. will only remain in NATO if European members, quote, pay their fair share. In contrast, Vice President Harris has said that the U.S. must have an unwavering commitment to NATO. So the Republicans and Democrats have two very different conceptions of America's role in NATO. Let's start with Paul Williams. Paul, why should Americans even care about NATO?
Well, Michael, let me use the wild card in my hand and adjust your question just a little bit and ask, do Americans care about NATO? And quite frankly, I think they do. I think Americans are very global in our perspective, despite what we may think sometimes. And we understand why security in Europe is important for American security. And we understand the value of having allies. But I also think Trump has his finger on the pulse of the American public on this one. Americans also care about our allies paying their fair share, and probably more importantly, about us not paying a disproportionate share. So I think whether it's Trump or whether it's Harris, I think it has to be a combination in the next administration of literally doubling down on our commitment to NATO, but also encouraging and forcing, if necessary, our NATO friends and allies to meet their fair share, maybe moving it up from 2% to 3% even, so that we actually can secure our future.
So let me turn to Colonel Mike Newton for a fact check. Is there anything to the argument that the NATO countries are not spending enough of their GDP on their defense?
Well, there was certainly validity to that for decades, and the fact that they didn't. And they knew it, and they deliberately let that happen. I will say Ukraine has woken them up to the need for an integrated defense strategy. You know, NATO is the umbrella organization that allows for legal interdependence and policy interdependence and defense interdependence. And I think it's in a backhanded way revitalized NATO. It's shocked it into a new awareness that, you know, these democratic institutions, that is one of the great success stories post-World War II in Western Europe, are fragile and are subject to threat. And we have to work together with friends and allies to defend them. So I think we're on the right pathway there.
So, Mike, you're saying that the former Trump administration actually accomplished the reforms in NATO that would strengthen the organization that you are advocating?
I think they started the conversation in a hostile way. It's the threat from Russia in Ukraine that has really, really galvanized that effort. Everything from Lithuania to across the board. And what the other sort of more subtle point is that people are realizing the outflows of trade, the supply chain defects, the ability simply to manufacture enough artillery shells. All of that is being reanalyzed in a way that countries are saying, are we actually serious about national defense? If we are, we've got to address these issues.
All right, so
in the 1970s, people didn't do that.
Let me turn to Harold, who is an expert at the workings of international organizations. If NATO needs some fixing, if you were president, what would your policy be?
Well, I think the key difference is whether you adopt a relational policy or a transactional policy. Trump's approach is entirely transactional. And one way to lose influence in an organization is by keep threatening to leave or to quit. What NATO is actually doing right now is building a wall inside to protect themselves in case Trump is elected president, so they can still support Ukraine despite what he does. And this has been a pattern of Trump's, resigning without leaving, which is one way to make yourself irrelevant. In fact, 23 of the 32 NATO countries have now hit 2%. And the only time that Article 5 has actually been triggered of the NATO Treaty for Self-Defense, it was triggered on behalf of the United States after September 11th. And what Biden has done is very substantially strengthened NATO. So when Putin expected what he called the Finlandization of NATO, what he got instead was the opposite, the NATOization of Finland and Sweden. So I think that the Biden approach has been a wise one. And a central contrast with Afghanistan, which we should have mentioned, is there are absolutely no U.S. boots on the ground inside of Ukraine. That was not true with regard to Afghanistan.
All right, let's now turn to the U.S.-China relationship. Now, Donald Trump has said that he would decouple the U.S. economy from China by enacting really high tariffs on half of Chinese exports to the U.S. Vice President Harris, on the other hand, has also made some strong statements about the economic and military threat posed by China, but she has opposed raising tariffs at all. Let me ask our two former State Department legal advisors, John Bellinger and Harold Koh. Do you think, first of all, is China as great an economic and military threat as both parties have come to believe, and whose approach is likely to best manage that threat? John, you want to kick things off?
Sure. I think the anti-Chinese rhetoric has gotten somewhat overinflated, with each party trying to outdo the other and showing how strong it is on China. But that said, China is a very significant military, economic, and I would say diplomatic adversary for the United States. It's not possible to decouple the two economies. They're just too interconnected. And if Americans suddenly found that the cost of their televisions or their phones or almost anything else around their house were to double, triple, quadruple because we've raised tariffs on China, then I think people would be very unhappy about that. So, the relationship just simply needs to be managed. And I'll just say here, one part of managing the relationship is having a effective diplomacy. We can't just manage the relationship with China and stand up to China militarily or economically. It's important to have strong diplomats. The Chinese are going all around the world, particularly in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and going behind our backs to try to woo other countries. And we need to be alert to that. And it's one reason why we need to have a strong State Department and a strong diplomatic corps to stand up to these efforts by China to undercut us with our allies around the world.
Harold, what would you add to that?
Well, what had been the bipartisan approach to China was that China should be part of the international system, but should play by the international rules, particularly the rules of the WTO. And the use of unilateral tariffs actually violates those rules and basically has the effect, as John said, of passing higher costs onto the consumer, which is a strange approach to take if people are worried about inflation. I think the danger here now is that our approach to going in and out of international organizations encourages the Chinese to set up their own system of international economic institutions, their own Belt and Road, their own Asian Development Bank. If that happens and is consummated, then there will be two alternative systems in the world, one based on a rules-based international order and another based on an authoritarian order. And those will be in competition. So we'll have a kind of economic Cold War instead. And I think that that's the wrong way to go.
Harold, let me ask you a follow-up. For years, there have been reports of Chinese human rights abuses against its minority Uyghur population in Western China. You served as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Do you think we should be using trade policy to induce China to improve its treatment of the Uyghurs? Or would you decouple trade from human rights?
No, I think we have to call them out. I think that there are a number of regions and areas where Beijing is enforcing extraordinary human rights violations. Hong Kong, the Tibet Autonomous Region, Xinjiang. And I think we need to flag that. People need to know what they're buying if they're buying things made with slave labor. And two administrations now, Mike Pompeo as well as Blinken, have called what's going on in Xinjiang genocide. So it may not have the effect that we want in terms of changing Chinese behavior, but I think as a matter of a consistency in our principled foreign policy, we need to keep stating this so that people don't lose sight of it.
Let's now turn to the issue of undocumented migration from south of the border. Mike Newton, why is this seen as such an important issue in this election?
Well, let me just say, I totally concur with what Harold just said. And oddly enough, China is connected to so many other foreign policy issues. In this news cycle are reports of two Chinese nationals, migrants, found with $250,000 in gold bars charged with money laundering. So China is interconnected to all of our foreign policy issues. On the migrants issue, I mean, I think Paul Williams hit it so on the head. Americans know in ways that they haven't in previous years, that all these foreign policy issues are affecting their daily lives. I mean, I don't necessarily agree empirically with Trump's claim and the Republicans' claim that they're taking your jobs, et cetera, except for the fact that the latest jobs report says that there is an imbalance, that those jobs aren't going to U.S. nationals. So I do think people are, and then all the hyperbolic press about crimes committed in communities. I think we really do have to get a focus on the border in a rational way. And I think that's the challenge for the Democratic nominee, who was, after all, the border czar, and the Republicans to come off the high-blown rhetoric of elections into the practicalities of governing. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine a scenario where you round up 220 million illegal aliens, right? They've got to figure out a way of addressing that in a rational way that resonates with the American people based on our values, and I just don't see that happening.
All right, so Mike, you just mentioned that President Biden had assigned Vice President Harris to be the administration's point person on the border issue. Let me turn to Milena and ask, what progress did she make?
So, Michael, as you said, President Biden appointed Vice President Harris to lead U.S. diplomatic efforts with Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and to really try to address the root causes of migration. Why are people from those countries trying to move to the United States? Back in July of 2021, the Biden administration actually published a strategy, a plan, which really focused on economic insecurity, gang violence, corruption, human rights abuses, etc., in Central America, and the administration actually secured more than $5 billion in private investment for the region to try to combat those issues. And then fast forward to February of 2024, earlier in this year, there was actually a bipartisan immigration reform proposal that had been on the table that unfortunately the GOP, under candidate Trump's efforts and influence, actually, refused to negotiate, because I think having negotiated immigration reform would have negatively affected candidate Trump's chances of being elected, because obviously, the seeming failure to achieve immigration reform is one of the talking points of candidate Trump.
All right. So, Milena, you just talked about this bipartisan deal that seemed to the public to be really, really close to coming to fruition, and then Trump intervened and it fell apart. Let me ask, Harold, can you tell us more about what happened?
Well, I think simply put, Trump wanted to keep it as an election issue, even though very conservative members of his own party, like Jim Lankford of Oklahoma, were ready to do the deal and actually address the issue. So this is a real triumph of electioneering over actually addressing serious problems. We've needed a comprehensive immigration solution for many years, and the person who made it not happen was Trump, in the name of fomenting chaos so he could have another election issue. That's not about governing, that's about self-interest.
So let me ask Paul Williams, do you think the electorate is going to blame the failure to enact stronger immigration policies on Trump or on Harris?
I think we have a situation, as Harold had just noted, that Trump has this unique / strange / weird, as some people would say, ability to affect and change the narrative. We know that Congress was on the cusp of adopting stronger immigration policies. Trump wanted to keep it an election issue, and it's one of the issues he's using most effectively against Vice President Harris.
All right, finally, let's talk about climate change. The past 12 months have been the hottest in recorded history. Even stalwart climate change deniers are growing concerned. But the two parties are really far apart on the way to address the crisis. President Biden has been the most pro-climate president. Donald Trump has railed against Biden's climate policies in his campaign speeches, deriding clean energy and vowing to push America back to fossil fuels. Milena Stereo, what can we expect if Donald Trump is back in the Oval Office?
Well, Michael, remember that Donald Trump, when he was president, actually pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement, he has very clearly stated that if elected president again, he would once again pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. We know that Donald Trump is in favor of gutting the agencies that oversee environmental protections in the United States, such as, for example, the EPA. And we know, in fact, that candidate Trump has said that he would dismantle most of President Biden's climate rules and policies. So I think on this one, it's absolutely clear what candidate Trump would do.
All right, I have time for one last question. I'm going to send it to Harold Koh and ask you this. Let's flip the perspective by asking you what's at stake for the world in the outcome of the U.S. presidential election. And we only have about 30 seconds.
I think what's at stake is the future of a rules-based international order, which previously had been supported by both political parties. And I think that, as President Macron said, there is no planet B, and there is no plan B. A unilateralist world is not going to succeed in bringing about the kind of multilateral solutions that address problems like climate change and pandemics which go across borders. So I think that's what's at stake, the future of the rules-based international order.
That is a great place to bring our program to a close. I'd like to thank our guests for sharing their expertise on the role that foreign policy issues will play in the upcoming presidential election. Whoever is the next president, it's clear they will have to avoid global war with Russia and China, respond to the escalating climate crisis, and grapple with the influx of undocumented migrants. The stakes, as Harold said, could not be higher in November. Harold Koh, John Bellinger, Mike Newton, Paul Williams, and Milena Stereo, thank you for providing your insights about a topic that may well determine the future leadership of our country. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy.